Welcome to Biology of Marine Mammals. I'm Dr. Leslie Williams, and this is the second lecture covering vertebral anatomy in marine mammals. In a previous lecture, we looked at cervical vertebrae, which are the first of 5 divisions. In this lecture, we'll continue with that and look at the other divisions, including the thoracic vertebrae, the lumbar and sacral vertebrae, the caudal vertebrae, and the additional bones known as chevron bones. To start, let's take a review of how we organize our vertebral column. It's convenient to take our vertebral column and divide them into multiple sections. Starting from the cranium or the skull, we have cervical, followed by thoracic, followed by lumbar, sacral, and then finally coccygeal. In order to actually figure out which regions are which, we start by defining the thoracic and the sacral vertebrae. So the thoracic vertebrae are going to be any vertebra that articulates with a rib, and so we define all of those vertebrae as thoracic vertebrae. The sacral vertebra is going to be any vertebra that actually attaches to a hip bone and forms part of the pelvic girdle. So the sacral vertebrae form part of the pelvis. That leaves us with cervical, lumbar, and coccygeal. And we say that the cervical vertebrae are going to be above thoracic, lumbar is in between thoracic and sacral, and coccygeal is below sacral. So in other words, once you've identified the thoracic and the sacral vertebra, you identify cervical, lumbar, and coccygeal as the ones in between. Now an interesting transition happens. We use coccygeal vertebrae to describe the vertebra below the sacrum in humans, but we also lack a real tail. So in mammals that have a pronounced tail, the coccygeal vertebra gets a different name, and they're called caudal vertebrae. So let's go ahead and start with the thoracic vertebrae. The thoracic vertebrae are going to be ones that articulate with the ribs, so that's their definition. Humans have 12 thoracic vertebrae, but the number in all mammals ranges between 9 and 18. As a general rule, marine mammals tend to have a greater number of thoracic vertebrae. So for example, 16 or 17 thoracic vertebrae would be a common number among the marine mammals. Now remember, the definition of a thoracic vertebra is to have a rib that articulates. So let's actually shift the conversation and talk about the ribs a little bit. So if we take a human, and you have a human thoracic vertebra, and we take the ribs and we basically start from the back and wrap around, we have to understand that the ribs can wrap all the way around to the front and articulate with the sternum. If they do that, that makes what's called a closed rib cage. In other words, the rib cage is completely closed. Most mammals possess a closed rib cage. Now, there is a disadvantage with having a closed rib cage, and that is it restricts your mobility. Why would your rib cage need to have mobility? It's to allow you to breathe. So I want everybody right now to actually try a breathing exercise where you breathe in really deeply and then exhale. And if you do so, you should actually feel that your rib cage expands a little bit and contracts, and expands a little bit and contracts with that breathing motion. In fact, you need to be able to expand your rib cage and contract to allow for breathing. So all rib cages must have a little bit of mobility to allow for breathing. Now that brings up a very interesting comparative anatomy study with marine mammals. Marine mammals tend to have very flexible rib cages. That flexibility is gained one of 2 ways. In the picture here on the left, and I'm going to go ahead and use the pointer, you can see that marine mammal rib cages are a little bit different here in these dolphins. You can see that they actually look like they possess a joint, and they really do. They have 2 parts to their rib cage, and as you can see here, this rib cage is expanded where the pointer is, but then when we go down here, you can see the rib cage has collapsed. That gives this dolphin a much greater flexibility in their rib cage. Alternatively, many marine mammals possess a mostly open rib cage, as shown in this picture right here of the harbor porpoise, where you can see most of the ribs do not articulate with the sternum and therefore are left open. Okay, so what is the advantage of these changes? An open rib cage, as seen with many completely aquatic marine mammals, such as cetaceans or the manatees, allows for large changes in lung volume due to diving. So in other words, if you have an open rib cage, you can collapse it very easily. You can shrink the rib cage very, very quickly by simply folding your ribs back. So if all of your ribs are out, then you can just fold them back, and you don't have any permanent attachment to the sternum, or not much of one, to prevent that from happening. So again, they're out when they're inhaling, and then when they're diving, they come back a little bit, and it collapses the rib cage. This is actually a very, very, very advantageous trait for divers, especially deep divers, because when you dive deep and you get under pressure, the volume of air also collapses. And if you don't have the ability to actually collapse your lungs with it, it can cause lung implosion, which would actually kill the mammal. So this allows them to collapse their lungs to prevent lung implosion during deep dives. Okay, so why isn't this more open strategy adopted by all marine mammals? Well, amphibious marine mammals still actually tend to have closed rib cages, as you can see in this picture here. So again, I'm going to pull you back over to this pointer here, and you can see the attachment to the sternum is pretty significant, which represents a closed rib cage that closes in the front. And we need that, or at least amphibious marine mammals need that. And that's because they're still hauling out onto land. When they haul out onto land, they are at risk of basically suffering blunt trauma to their vital organs, including their heart and their lungs, from rocks and other projections from basically dragging their bodies on land. So the selection pressure that favors a closed rib cage is basically exposure to something that would increase the risk of blunt trauma. Now, truly aquatic marine mammals like manatees and some cetacean, they're in the water all of the time. The likelihood that they're going to be landing against fierce rocks and subject to blunt trauma is pretty low. So therefore, they're not under the same selection pressures that amphibious marine mammals are, such as the pinnipeds. So that right there tells you the tale of two different strategies to accommodate a flexible rib cage. Again, cetaceans and truly aquatic marine mammals tend to have a more open rib cage, and then pinnipeds, which still come out on land, tend to have a closed rib cage, but they get their flexibility with an extra joint in that rib cage. So now that we've finished with thoracic vertebrae, let's move to the next division, which is the lumbar vertebra. Now I'm going to actually start by pointing out some human lumbar vertebra, which I have over here. And you can see that the human lumbar vertebra has a very large vertebral body. It's one of their defining features, and relatively reduced projections. In other words, the pieces that are sticking out are going to be rather truncated and not very long. If we look over here, this is actually a lumbar vertebra from some type of dolphin, most likely, or possibly a porpoise. And one of the things you might notice is, while they do have still a moderately large vertebral body, the processes that come out are huge. In other words, we see very, very elongated processes. This is the spinous process, and this is the transverse process. So that right there tells you that maybe something is going on with the design of these lumbar vertebrae that certain marine mammals need to accommodate where humans do not. So let's actually come back over and we'll take a look at the picture here on the screen. So when we take a look at the picture here on the screen, you can see I have one up of a southern elephant seal, and take a good look at its lumbar vertebra, and you can see that we see something more similar to the humans with short processes and large bodies. So there's that large body right there. So amphibious marine mammals tend to show this trait, whereas they retain large bodies and short processes, where fully aquatic marine mammals tend to have more elongated processes and not necessarily as big of a vertebral body. Now, the elongated processes have an advantage. What do you think that advantage is? Remember, the more surface area you have, the more sites you have for muscle attachment. And fully aquatic marine mammals are swimming constantly. So that additional space allows for additional muscles to attach to those vertebrae, which are necessary to allow those marine mammals to consistently swim in this manner. So a quick teaser question that kind of sums this up: which lumbar vertebrae are going to be more like humans? Are you going to have pinniped vertebrae or amphibious marine mammals that have lumbar vertebrae more like humans, or fully aquatic marine mammals such as the dolphins and whales? And again, I have a picture here that shows the lumbar vertebrae of a dolphin, actually a bottlenose dolphin, and you can see once again those very large elongated processes, and the vertebral bodies are not that significant of a component compared to the pinnipeds one, which are over here. This is a harbor seal, short processes and large vertebral body. We also possess a large vertebral body and short processes, so pinnipeds, which come out on land and need to still support their weight against gravity, tend to show vertebral bodies that are more like most mammals, including humans, where cetaceans and some sirenians, which are in the water, not subject to the same gravitational forces, but need to swim all the time and thus need to have a lot of muscle attachments running along that vertebral column, have shorter vertebral bodies, they don't need them for support, and longer processes so that those muscles can grab in and help propel them forward. All right, with lumbar, let's move to sacral vertebrae. So interestingly enough, truly aquatic marine mammals actually have no hind limbs. So the tails are not really hind limbs. The tails are actually extensions of the last bit of vertebra. So they have no hind limbs. In fact, they've lost them, which means there's no need for a hip bone. If there's no need for a hip bone, it becomes absent or greatly reduced, a term referred to as vestigial. And therefore, if there's no hip bone, there's no sacral vertebra. So sirenians and cetaceans do not have sacral vertebrae, which poses this question: how do you define the transition between lumbar and caudal vertebrae? So that poses a really interesting question. If there's no sacral vertebra, where do the lumbar vertebra end and the caudal vertebra begin? And the answer actually comes in a new set of bones that are not found on humans, but are found on many mammals, and those are called chevron bones. So in this picture here, this is actually a gray whale skeleton taken from the Monterey Bay Aquarium, and up here we can see the bones more or less look the same going down. But then here we can see the addition of these funky little Y-shaped bones that are basically on the underside of the caudal vertebra. So the caudal vertebrae begin with the presence of these additional bones called chevron bones. And the chevron bones are not completely attached, but they do sit nice and tight with those caudal vertebrae. So what's the purpose of chevron bones? Well, chevron bones actually protect blood vessels that are running down and protecting the fluke. So if you are consistently swimming and doing this motion with your fluke here, then one of the things that you're going to need is a whole lot of blood to serve all those muscles that are working tirelessly to propel you through the water. So you want to have some way to protect that blood supply, and so the blood basically funnels in between those Y-shaped bones. So the chevron bones kind of look like this, and they basically come right underneath the tail here like this, and then the blood vessels run right in them. And that helps protect the blood vessels that are serving the fluke, because obviously damage to them would be fatal to the organism. All right, and finally, the last thing that I wanted you to note is the idea that as we get past the lumbar and into the caudal bones, we notice that the process length diminishes significantly. And I actually have up here an Odontoceti, I don't know what species it is, but some Odontoceti caudal vertebrae. And the caudal vertebrae, you can see we have lumbar up here, but then as we move down this way, you can see the process length gets shorter and shorter and shorter. That is necessary to allow range of motion at the fluke. And we can see the outcome of that here with a blue whale that is basically showing its fluke. And you can see that at the fluke you have a great range of motion that allows you to get one nice big push before diving. With that, I'll see you next time.